70 years ago, the world economy was mired in a deep depression, and the question in the minds of policymakers and academics alike was, why doesn't this situation correct itself? The classical economists had taught the faith that wages and prices would adjust to restore the equilibrium between supply and demand. And if there was a lot of slack demand for labor, then wages would fall until businesses wanted to hire the workers and unemployment was reduced. However, this didn't happen. Wages and prices didn't fall in the 1930s by very much, and instead there were unemployment rates of 25% and higher in some countries of the world. Enter John Maynard Keynes, an economist with an original idea. John Maynard Keynes was trained in mathematics and became an economic professor at Cambridge University in England. His original idea was that if wages and prices are fixed or sticky because of some other problems with adjustment in the economy, then what would happen in a period of slack demand would be unemployment, depression, and the misery that the world was witnessing in the 1930s. Keynes's policy prescription was that businesses and consumers should increase their spending so as to lift the economy out of this depression. But if businesses and consumers were gloomy and wouldn't increase their own demand, the government should step in and make up for the demand that consumers and businesses weren't exerting. So government policy could lift the economy out of depression by stimulating demand. Keynes's thought was at odds with the thought of classical economists who worked in the tradition of Adam Smith. The belief of the classical economists was that wages and prices adjusted to clear the market. So Keynes's idea was very radical because it questioned a central tenet of economics, that is, the adjustment of wages and prices. Now, what began to happen quite quickly could be described as a Keynesian revolution. In 1936, Keynes published his general theory of employment, interest, and money. In it, he laid out the ideas of demand driving the economy in a situation where prices and wages were sticky. Keynes died in 1946, shortly before his ideas had achieved general worldwide currency. Academics in the late 40s and 1950s came to agree that Keynes understood the economy correctly, and they had the evidence of the 1930s and 40s to back them up. That is, the New Deal spending in the United States under the Roosevelt administration did wonders for the economy, but not as much wonder as World War II did. When the economy geared up for wartime production, people were put back to work, and the increase in income led to an increase in consumption and vigorous economic health. By the 1950s, academics understood that Keynes's ideas had merit, and by the 1960s, they had thoroughly infiltrated governments around the world. Fiscal policy was understood to be a great way to stimulate your economy out of a recession and to slow your economy down when it was booming too vigorously. By the 1960s, economists and government policymakers could say, "We are all Keynesians now." Keynes's view had come to dominate the economic scene. The 1970s, however, put Keynes's thought on bad times. We observed in the 1970s high oil prices at the same time that the economy slipped into recession. That is, the efforts of the government to stimulate the economy through increased government spending seemed to lead only to inflation and not to increases in employment and output. So the 1970s tested faith in Keynes's theories. In the 1980s, however, economists came to reformulate Keynes's ideas, putting them on sure microeconomic foundations. That is, many of the reasons for which wages and prices were presumed to be sticky were re-examined and made more sophisticated. And in light of these new theories, Keynes's ideas were rehabilitated and restored to popularity. In the 1990s, and as we enter the 21st century, there is a whole group of people who trace their economic roots to John Maynard Keynes. The new Keynesians look for ways of explaining why wages and prices might be sticky and why demand does indeed drive the economy. Keynes was an enigmatic personality and someone who was obviously greatly respected by his students and quite influential at the highest levels of government. He was someone who believed in the power of ideas. One of his most famous quotations is this: "The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood." Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. Sooner or later, it is ideas, not vested interests, which are dangerous for good or evil. Keynes's ideas are very much with us today, and in fact, they are still in dialogue with the classical economists whose own ideas have been made more sophisticated. This is what the excitement in macroeconomics is all about. Keynes, who can rightfully be called the father of modern macroeconomics, founded macroeconomics on a radical idea that was at odds with the classical economists. The classical economists have come back with their own formulation of why the Great Depression happened and how government policy may or may not be able to help. The debate between the Keynesians and the monetarists keeps changing forms as both sides make their arguments more sophisticated and more rigorous. But it is Keynes's influence that is still felt in economics today, because his original idea changed the way people thought about what caused depressions and how to get out of them.